I know many of us had our attention focused across the Atlantic Ocean this week, and not just because of Guy Fawkes Day, but mostly because of the crucial climate change conference in Glasgow. And we were praying that world leaders step up on their commitment to recognize the existential threat of this climate emergency. We know that many in our community have been fighting for climate justice, living the value from the second chapter of Genesis to till and to tend the earth for years. At Beth Am, we have a bold commitment to climate advocacy, including our work with the RAC, the Religious Action Center, and more recently, Dayenu. If you're interested in being part of the climate justice conversation, please reach out to me or any of the clergy. And one of the people who has dedicated her life to climate action is Erica Dodds. Erica Dodds is the COO of the Foundation for Climate Restoration, a nonprofit committed to removing excess carbon from our atmosphere. She spends much of her time speaking about how proactive optimism is the most rational response to the existential threat of climate change. She has presented all over the world, including at the United Nations headquarters and at climate convenings across the country. She holds a PhD and an MA in International Development Administration, and she believes that global climate action should focus on restoring our climate to safe and healthy conditions that will safeguard our planet for future generations. She's been an active member of Beth Am and at the Orchard, is here tonight with her terrific husband Jeff and her mom Sharon. So it's a delight to welcome Erica to our Bima this evening.
Well, thank you so much to Rabbi Prosnett for inviting me to speak to you all this evening. It's particularly an honor because I grew up in this Jewish community here, first here at Beth Am and then at Etz Chaim. And I've really always appreciated the values of this community, and in particular, the importance of tikkun olam, seeking to repair the world and social justice. From a young age, I decided I wanted to work to make the world a better place. And I wanted to specifically do that through poverty reduction. So I stayed in school until I was 29, going straight through from public school to undergrad to master's to PhD. And throughout, I made choices that I thought would really prepare me for my career in poverty alleviation. A bachelor's in international studies, a master's in international development administration, and a PhD in evaluating international development programs. As I went through my studies, I kept hearing about climate change, but I was really determined not to be derailed from my career trajectory. There were other people working on climate change, and they're way more qualified than me. In my master's program, I remember reading an evaluation of an international development program that was working on implementing an agricultural training program in rural India. The program area experienced a dramatic flood that wiped out the farms in the area. The population was forced to relocate. The program completely shifted its focus to providing aid to the affected community and attempting here and there to provide some agricultural education. My professor asked us, since we were reading this evaluation, to see whether this program worked. So he asked us, was this program successful? They had sought to do an agricultural extension program, and in reality, they didn't. They didn't accomplish any of their objectives, but they did provide aid to a community in need. And it just seemed like an impossible question. How do you evaluate whether something like this worked? Over the following years, I started seeing more and more of this type of story. The best-intentioned, evidence-based interventions weren't working just because climate change could derail them on a dime. But I was still determined not to get involved. By now, it felt really clear to me that we're doomed, so what could I possibly do? Not long after this, I heard something that turned my world upside down. I was talking to Peter Fikowski, the founder of the Foundation for Climate Restoration, and he told me that our global goals, things like the Paris Agreement or the ambition to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius or getting to net zero emissions, all of these goals aren't focused on ensuring a safe climate for future generations. They're focused on limiting the damage that we're doing to our climate, not fixing the damage. I learned that while everything I'd heard about climate change was about reducing emissions, those emissions don't just disappear once they get into the atmosphere. If you think of our atmosphere as a bathtub, we've been single-mindedly focused on turning down the faucet and reducing the emissions that we're adding to our climate system. But the water that's already been added to the tub, our legacy emissions, they continue to collect and linger for hundreds to thousands of years. So even if we turned off the faucet and we stopped adding emissions to the atmosphere right now, climate change wouldn't be solved. The tub is still overflowing. So that's a downer. But it's only half the story. Because next, Peter said something that I thought was pretty groundbreaking. He said, shouldn't our global goals be focused on an outcome we want to achieve? Shouldn't we be focused on fixing the problem in addition to reducing the damage we're doing? Going back to our bathtub analogy, it's actually pretty simple. We already have a drain in our tub that already removes about half of our annual emissions using natural carbon sinks like oceans and forests. But the problem is that these are getting damaged and becoming less and less effective over time, and half of our emissions are still just staying in the tub. But still, we can build a larger drain by developing technologies that either accelerate and optimize these natural processes or that mimic them using technological and industrial processes. This idea struck a deep chord with me because I hadn't even considered that tikkun olam could apply to our climate. It feels obvious to me in retrospect, but at the time, I'd been so certain we were already doomed, I couldn't even imagine the possibility of working towards a restored climate. But we can shift our trajectory and work towards a safe and healthy climate, a climate like my great-grandparents had, a climate like the one humans in our natural world evolved to thrive in, a restored climate. Achieving this goal won't be easy, but it certainly isn't impossible, and it's our duty to take it on. Last month, at the Vatican, a gathering of 40 faith leaders representing all of the major faiths came together to call for ambitious climate action to restore our common home. At this meeting, the worldwide Jewish community was represented by Rabbi Noam Marantz of the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations and Rabbi Daniel Schwartz of the Coalition on the Environment in Jewish Life. Together, these 40 leaders called upon their own communities of faith as well as our global political leaders to take up the mantle of climate action for the sake of future generations. This has never happened before. I mean, in the couple thousand years that the Catholic Church has been around, all major religions have never before come together to call for, to issue a call to action to the world. As the Pope said, climate restoration is of utmost importance. I joined Peter's organization as soon as I could, and I've been here for 4 years now. This organization, the Foundation for Climate Restoration, is committed to restoring a safe and healthy climate by the year 2050. We recognize that in order to restore the climate, we need to remove 1 trillion tons of excess CO2 from the air and store it away permanently. When our organization was founded, we thought if only there were solutions that could remove all this excess CO2 from the atmosphere, our job would basically be done. But as we began looking into it, we found that there were a surprising number of really promising solutions already. For example, did you know that there's a company right here in Silicon Valley that uses a simple chemical reaction to create synthetic limestone that can then be used in concrete? And since concrete is the most used material on Earth after water, the capacity of this solution alone could take up more than half the CO2 that we need to store away. It's remarkable. And yet, this solution and others are just not being adopted and scaled very quickly. So pretty quickly, we realized that just having the tools to restore the climate isn't enough. We need the conditions to be right for those tools to be used. So we set out to create an enabling environment. It was time to build a movement to mobilize the world towards climate restoration. So we built up programs that provide the education and advocacy needed to raise awareness about the goal of climate restoration and the available solutions, and to develop the supportive policies needed to put them in place. Now we have 18 local grassroots advocacy chapters operating in 12 countries on 4 continents. We have a youth leadership program that uses a train-the-trainer model to quickly scale the number of young people who know about and can educate others about climate restoration. And we've already had participants in the program from 35 countries on all 6 continents. This movement is growing, and there's a role for everyone to play. Right now in Glasgow, COP26, the big annual UN climate summit, is underway. Policymakers from around the world are gathering to make announcements about their countries' commitments to reduce their emissions. Net zero by 2070, by 2050, by 2045. Most notably, today, the US Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, announced the carbon negative shot. It's the 3rd target in the DOE's Energy Earthshots initiative, and it's focused on getting the US to gigaton scale carbon removal by mid-century to enable us to meet our net zero by 2050 target. It's ambitious and exciting. These commitments show incredible progress. There's recognition at the highest levels that we need to be building a bigger drain for our climate bathtub in addition to turning off the faucet. But still, these leaders have not brought tikkun olam into their climate action. They aren't yet looking at what it will take to repair and restore a climate that will allow future generations to thrive. They're still really focused on reducing the damage. This fact has come into sharper focus for me recently as I've been preparing for my own future generation. In fact, I came here straight from a prenatal appointment. The conditions in 2050 have never felt so relevant to me or so real as they do when I think about my future son, who will only be 28 years old in 2050. He'll have his whole future ahead of him, but it's up to all of us today to make sure that that future is a bright one full of possibilities. Communities like Beth Am that are so deeply involved in social justice have a special role to play here. We have the opportunity to change the paradigm around climate change from one of harm reduction to one of restoration and flourishing. But paradigm shifts don't happen without widespread calls for change. If you're interested in getting involved, please come talk to me after the service or reach out via email if you're watching on live stream. You can reach me at erica@f4cr, that's f4cr.org. Thank you all for your commitment to future generations, and Shabbat Shalom.